Hi everyone and welcome back to Clark Trending. If you are a Caitlin Clark fan, comment CC 100% love right now before we even get into this, because what I'm about to share with you today is going to completely reframe how you understand what is happening in the WNBA right now. I'm not talking about a trade rumor. I'm not talking about a hypothetical. I am talking about a series of real, documented, verified developments that point in one unmistakable direction, and by the time we're done here, you are going to see the entire landscape differently. So please, stay with me until the very end of this video, because the most important piece of this puzzle doesn't drop until the final minutes. Trust me on that. Now before we dive in, I need to say this quickly. If you look at the numbers, about 90% of you watching right now are not subscribed to this channel. That's wild to me. If you enjoy this kind of deep, honest, no-spin coverage of Caitlin Clark and the WNBA, just tap that subscribe button and hit the bell. It takes 1 second, and it helps us keep doing this work. Alright, let's get into it. So here's where we are. Multiple credible reports have surfaced over the past 72 hours indicating that Caitlin Clark's representatives have engaged in preliminary conversations, and I want to stress that word, preliminary, with the New York Liberty's front office regarding a potential move. Now, I need to be careful here. Nobody is saying a deal is done. Nobody is saying Clark has demanded a trade. But according to sources familiar with the discussions, the Liberty have made it known through back channels that they would be willing to restructure significant roster assets to make room for Clark, and Clark's camp has not shut that door. Let me repeat that. They have not shut that door. And in professional sports, when a player's representatives leave a door open, that is not an accident. That is a signal. Now let's rewind for a second, because this did not come out of nowhere. If you've been following this channel, you know we've been tracking the tension between Clark and the Indiana Fever's organizational direction for months. Remember the post-game press conference in May where Clark was asked about the team's off-season roster additions? Let's listen to what she had to say. She said, and I'm quoting directly here, "I think, I trust the front office to do what they feel is right. I'm just focused on what I can control on the court." Now on the surface, that sounds like a standard athlete non-answer. But take note of what she chose not to do. She did not say she was excited about the additions. She did not endorse the direction. She did not say, "We." She said, "They." She said she trusts the front office to do what they feel is right. Not what is right. What they feel is right. That is a distinction that might seem small if you're not paying attention, but in the world of athlete media training, that kind of phrasing is deliberate. It creates distance without creating a headline. And that's the kind of information that causes people to ask uncomfortable questions. And then, there's the Stephanie White factor. White, who took over as head coach with enormous expectations, has faced a mid-season stretch where the Fever's record has slipped below the trajectory that Clark's individual performance would suggest. After a particularly rough loss in July, White told reporters, "We're building something here that's bigger than any single game or any single stretch. I believe in this group." And again, listen to the construction. She said she believes in this group, not in our star. Not in Caitlin and the pieces around her. She said, "This group," which in coaching language typically signals a philosophy of collective identity. And that's a perfectly reasonable coaching philosophy. But here's the tension. The entire economic architecture of this franchise, the ticket sales, the jersey numbers, the broadcast windows, is built around one person. So when you have a coach publicly emphasizing the group and a franchise player privately wondering if the group is good enough, you have a fault line. And fault lines eventually produce earthquakes. Now let's bring in the Liberty side of this, because that's where things get even more interesting. New York, under the leadership of a front office that has been aggressive and unapologetic about pursuing championships, has apparently identified Clark as the kind of transformational addition that doesn't come along twice in a generation. A league source told The Athletic, and I'm paraphrasing the reporting here, that New York's ownership group views Clark not just as a basketball acquisition, but as a commercial infrastructure upgrade. Those are heavy words. That's not how you talk about a point guard. That's how you talk about a franchise-altering asset. And when ownership groups start using language like that, you know the conversations have moved past casual interest. But here's what most people missed. About 2 weeks before these Liberty reports surfaced, WNBA Commissioner Kathy Engelbert gave an interview where she was asked directly about player movement and franchise stability. She said, "We want our stars to be in environments where they can thrive. And we also want our franchises to feel secure in their investments. It's a balance." Now that sounds diplomatic. But I went back and compared it to what Engelbert said about a similar question 18 months ago, and the difference is striking. Previously, she had said, and I quote, "Franchise stability is foundational to what we're building. Full stop. No qualifier about stars thriving. No acknowledgement of attention to balance." So the fact that she is now publicly framing this as a balance, rather than as a settled principle, tells you something has shifted at the institutional level. The league office is preparing its language for a world where star movement is not an aberration, but a feature. Alright, now if you're finding this breakdown valuable, do me a quick favor. Drop a like on this video. It genuinely helps push this content to more people who care about this story, and it lets me know this is the kind of deep work you want to see. Okay, let's keep going. Because now I need to bring in the fan dimension, and this is where it gets emotional. Fever fans, and I say this with genuine respect, because Indiana's fanbase has been one of the most passionate and loyal in the entire league. Fever fans are processing this in real time, and it is raw. Social media has been flooded with reactions. One post that went massively viral, over 2 million views on X, was a Fever fan account that simply wrote, "We showed up. Every game. Sold out the building. And this is what we get?" And that sentiment, that feeling of betrayal from a fan base that did everything right, that bought the tickets and the jerseys and believed in the rebuild, that is real, and it matters. Because when a fan base turns from heartbroken to angry, that's when ownership groups start making phone calls they weren't planning to make. Now, Indiana's front office has not issued a formal statement, which is itself revealing. Typically, when trade rumors surface about a franchise player, the team puts out something generic but firm. "We are committed to building around our core." The Fever's silence is deafening. And in the media world, silence from an organization that should be shouting from the rooftops about its commitment to its biggest star? That's not discretion. That's an organization that knows something it can't say yet. Now let me put my analyst hat on for a second, because I think most of the coverage of this story is missing the structural picture entirely. The real story isn't whether Clark goes to New York. The real story is why this moment was inevitable, and what it reveals about the WNBA's current power architecture. Here's what nobody is talking about. The WNBA is in the middle of the most consequential media rights negotiation window in its history. The league's deal with Disney, Amazon, and the other broadcast partners has created an environment where individual player value is quantifiable in a way it never was before. And the data, the viewership spikes, the social media engagement metrics, the merchandise velocity, all of it points to a concentration of commercial value in a very small number of players, with Clark at the absolute apex. Now follow the money on this. If Clark is in Indiana, she is playing in a mid-market building with a regional broadcast footprint that, while growing, does not maximize her national exposure windows. If Clark is in New York, she is in the largest media market in the country, playing in a building that hosts nationally televised games at a higher rate, partnered with a roster that could credibly compete for a championship. And championships mean more broadcast windows, which means more advertising revenue, which means the league's overall valuation increases. So let me break this down for you plainly. The league does not want Clark to leave Indiana. But the league's own economic incentives make it very difficult to construct a compelling argument for why she should stay if the Liberty present a credible offer. This is the fundamental contradiction, and it's one that other leagues have faced before. Think about the NBA and how it handled the super team era. When Kevin Durant went to the Warriors, the league publicly wrung its hands about competitive balance while privately celebrating the ratings bonanza of a dynasty. Commissioner Adam Silver expressed concern about parity, while cashing checks generated by concentration of talent. The WNBA is approaching its own version of that exact dilemma, and Engelbert's shifting language tells you she knows it. Now some people might say Clark has a contractual obligation, and the Fever control her rights, so none of this matters until Indiana decides it matters. And technically, that's correct. But here's why that argument doesn't hold up in the current environment. A player of Clark's magnitude has leverage that transcends the contract. If Clark were to publicly express even mild dissatisfaction, not a demand, not an ultimatum, just a carefully worded statement about wanting to compete for championships, the pressure on Indiana's front office would become unsurvivable. Every sponsor conversation would shift. Every free agent target would recalculate. The franchise's entire 5-year plan would be destabilized not by an action, but by an implication. And that's the kind of power that no CBA clause can contain. If you connect the dots between the Liberty's backchannel outreach, Engelbert's evolved language, White's collective identity coaching philosophy, and Clark's increasingly precise non-endorsements of her current situation, you get a picture of a slow-moving convergence that is accelerating toward a decision point. I see 3 realistic outcomes here. First, Indiana panics and makes a significant mid-cycle roster upgrade to convince Clark that the organization is matching her ambition. I'd put that at about 35% likely. Second, Clark stays through the current contract cycle, says the right things publicly, but her camp continues conversations that position her for movement at the first structural opportunity. I'd put that at about 45%. And third, something breaks before the off-season, a catastrophic playoff exit, a public moment of visible frustration, a leaked conversation, and the timeline accelerates dramatically. 20%, but that 20% is the scenario with the highest consequences. The key domino, the single event that triggers everything else, is the Fever's playoff performance this season. If Indiana makes a deep run, the entire conversation resets. Clark stays, White is validated, the front office exhales. But if Indiana exits early, and especially if they exit against a team that Clark could have beaten with better surrounding talent, then every piece of restraint she has shown for 18 months collapses under the weight of a simple, undeniable conclusion. She did her part, and they didn't do theirs. ESPN's Holly Rowe touched on this dynamic last week when she said, "You know, I've covered this league for a long time, and, the players who change franchises, it's never really about one thing. It's about an accumulation. And right now, you can feel things accumulating in Indiana." That's someone who has relationships in every locker room in the league, choosing those words carefully. Accumulation. Not crisis. Not rupture. Accumulation. Because that's exactly what this is. A slow gathering of weight on a structure that was not engineered to hold it. And that brings us to what this means long term. For Clark, a move to New York wouldn't just be a basketball decision. It would be a commercial metamorphosis. New York is where endorsement portfolios go to multiply. It's where media availability creates a feedback loop of visibility that compounds over years. Her current Nike deal, her existing partnerships, all of them have escalation clauses and market exposure components that would activate differently in New York than in Indianapolis. Her camp knows this. The Liberty's ownership knows this. And increasingly, everyone in the WNBA's ecosystem knows this. For Stephanie White, the stakes are existential in a different way. A coach who loses a player of Clark's caliber, whether through trade or through the slower erosion of trust, carries that outcome on her resume for the rest of her career. Fair or not, the narrative becomes, she had the most marketable player in the history of women's basketball, and she couldn't build a world that made her want to stay. Former player and current analyst Chiny Ogwumike made a comment that I think captures the emotional core of this entire saga. She said, This isn't just about basketball anymore. This is about whether a league that has been fighting for respect for 28 years can handle the weight of its own success. And I think that's exactly right. The WNBA spent decades begging for attention. Now it has it, concentrated in one extraordinary person, and the question is whether the institution is mature enough to manage the gravitational distortion that kind of stardom creates. So where does that leave us? It leaves us watching. It leaves us paying attention to post-game word choices, and front office silences, and back-channel signals that will tell the story long before any official announcement ever does. The Fever's next 10 games are not just basketball. They are an audition, the franchise auditioning for its own franchise player, trying to prove that the future she imagined when she arrived is still the future they can deliver. And if they can't, well, New York doesn't rebuild. New York recruits. And right now, New York is waiting by the phone with a pitch that Indiana might not be able to match. Not because they lack the money, but because they might lack the time. This story is not over. I'd argue it hasn't even properly started. Stay subscribed, because when the next domino falls, we'll be here first. Until then, I'm Clark Trending, and I'll see you in the next one.